In this video, we're going to look at how we can customize the layout and the calculations within our pivot table. In the previous video, we created several pivot tables, and in each case, when we added a numeric value to our values quadrant, it summed it up. So what this pivot table is showing us is the total capacity for each region from 2000 to 2019. What Rohan would like to see is the average capacity across the same time frame. So we're going to have to change our calculation. There are quite a few ways of doing this. If you come to the field in the values quadrant and click, you can choose value field settings. But if you come into one of the calculations themselves and right click, you actually get a lot more options. So that's what we're going to do. And if you scroll down to summarize values by, you'll see the calculations used most frequently, and there's our average. If you wanted a calculation that you didn't see in the list, again, right click, but this time we're going to come to value field settings, and this gives us the complete set of calculations. You can see it's not a very extensive list. What we're going to do now is set this back to a sum calculation, and then we're going to say OK. Sometimes, however, we don't want to see discrete values. We actually want to compare the values. So for example, Rohan would like to see what percentage of capacity is made up of non-renewable versus renewable for each region. To do this again, we're going to right click, but we're going to come to show values as, and there are a lot of calculations for generating percentages. So for example, percentage of grand total will recalculate each of those values as percentage of grand total. But what we would like to see is a percentage of the row total. So I'm going to select that. And now we can straight away see that South America and Central America, more than 60% of their capacity is renewable. Now, there are loads of options, so unfortunately, we can't look at all of them, but let's look at one of the more interesting ones. I'm going to right click, come to show values as, and right near the bottom, you actually have the option to rank your fields. So what Rohan would like to do is rank the regions based on capacity from largest to smallest. And I'm going to click on that, and it's checking that we want region. I'm going to say OK, and Asia has a 1. That means it has the largest renewable capacity, whereas the Middle East has the smallest. Now to remove the calculation, we just right click, come to show values as, and choose no calculation. So quite a few options there for changing our calculations. Let's now make our pivot tables look a little bit more attractive. So for this, I'm going to come to my capacity by year sheet. And the first thing we'd like to do is change our number formatting. I don't want so many decimal places. I would like a separator for every 3 zeros, 1000 separator, and again, loads of different options here, but I'd like to show you the value field settings again. In value field settings, you have not only the option to choose which function to summarize by, you can also select show values as to change your calculation, and you can change your number format. So if you're making a lot of changes, this dialog is a good option. And when I click number format, I can choose any of the standard ones or create my own. I'm just going to come to number, set it to 0 decimal places, and I do want 1000 separator, and then I'm going to say OK. And the other thing I can do is I can actually change my table name. So instead of sum of electricity, I'm going to remove that and make that total and say OK. So that looks a little bit better. But for a really great selection of options for changing the formatting of your table, we're going to come to our Design tab. So make sure you're in your pivot table and click Design. And here we have options for changing both our style and our layout. So we'll start with the styles. I'm going to click the drop down, the More button, and these just change your border colors and your cell color. But some of them really make your tables look nice, so choose one you like the look of. You can then slightly tweak those style options, or you can change the layout. So let's start with our grand totals. Grand totals automatically show for each column in each row, but you can choose to switch them on for both, or you can switch them on for one or the other. I'm going to leave mine on for both. Now, subtotals. The moment you have more than one field in your rows or your columns quadrant, you will automatically get subtotals. And by default, they show at the top of the group. But you can choose to turn these off, or you can choose to show them at the bottom of the group. It may seem a bit more logical, but it does take more space. We can also change our report layout, so clicking the drop-down by default, it shows in compact form. But we could choose outline form, or the more conventional tabular form. And if you choose tabular, you can also choose to repeat all the item labels. So this now looks more like a conventional table, and I could copy-paste values and repivot if I wanted to. I don't, and I must admit, I prefer the compact forms. I'm going to switch back to that. And lastly, you have the option to add a blank row after each group, and this just adds readability to your table to make it look nice. Now, having to go through this process for every pivot table can be a little bit time consuming, and if you have 2019 Excel or later, you actually have the new option to change your default styles of your tables. And I'll quickly show you how to do this. We're going to come to File, then Options and Data, and right at the top is Make Changes to the default layout of pivot tables. We're going to click the Edit Default Layout. And you can either import it from an existing pivot table or just go and set it up manually. And then if you decide you want to go back to the default, you can always do that. So if you have one of the later versions, I encourage you to come in there and have a play. I'm going to cancel for now and OK. You also have a few slightly more hidden layout options behind the right click. And to demonstrate these, I'm going to get the region field for my field list and drop it into the top of my rows quadrant. So I now have a breakdown by region as well. And now you can see I'm getting two sets of subtotals, but I don't want both. I actually want to switch it off for the region, and we can do this. I'm going to come to one of the regions and right click, and there's an option to show or not show the subtotal. And when I select that, you can see it's now switched off the subtotals for my regions. And what's even more interesting is you can change the calculation for your subtotal. So to do this, I'm going to come to Non-Renewable, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to come down to Field Settings. Now at this point, I could switch it off, or I can come to Customize, and I could choose to have an average, or I can have an average and a sum. So one click turns it on, another click turns it off. And then I'm going to say OK. And I'm now getting two subtotals. It has moved them to the bottom, but isn't that amazing? Finally, if we come to our Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, on the far left is an Options button. And in the newer version, there's a really interesting option in the Layout and Format which allows us to specify what we want to see when there's no data for that field. So pivot tables by default show it as a blank cell, but we could choose to show it as a 0. I'm going to say OK, and the change has been made. Now we don't really want to keep our region in our rows quadrant, so I'm going to grab region, grab and drop that out to get rid of it. And there's our beautifully formatted pivot table. So the main takeaways from this video: to change your calculations, right-click on one of the calculated values, and you've got your show values by or your show values as. To change both your layout and your styling, you've got your design ribbon to make your pivot look great.